Please follow UBC Migration on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is up on the PPT slide here and is at UBC Migration. I would also like to thank our co-sponsor, UBC Public Humanities Hub. And I would like to thank the team that's been working behind this series of events hosted by us, by our group, Douglas Ober, Dustin Gray, Emily Ambergay, and Atiye Yetta. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Lynne Pearce is Professor of Literary and Cultural Theory at Lancaster University, where she has worked for 30 years. She is author or co-author and editor of 17 books on topics which include feminist literary and cultural theory, romance and critical love studies, diasporic and regional writing, as well as mobilities studies. Her most recent publications in the field of mobility scholarship include Drivetime, Excursions in Automotive Consciousness, Mobility and the Humanities, and Mobility, Memory, and Life course in 20th Century Literature and Culture. She is also co-editor of the Palgrave book series, Studies in Mobilities, Literature, and Culture, with Marianne Aguiar and Charlotte Mathieson. Lynne has been director for the Humanities at Lancaster's Center for Mobilities Research since 2015. So it is our pleasure to host her talk today, which is titled Rethinking the Road, Autoethnography, Memory, and Transient Landscapes. Let's welcome her. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much, Gao, and welcome to everyone. It's very exciting, if a little bit nerve-wracking, to be talking to scholars the other side of the world. It's just amazing that we can do this, of course, and despite a few technical hitches, I hope that we're now on course and we'll manage to communicate with you successfully for the next couple of hours. So it's always exciting speaking to scholars the other side of the world, and it's really great for us to know that Mobilities Research has now extended far and wide as well, and is reaching an ever wider audience. So as you can see from this first slide, I come bearing greetings from CeMoRe, that's our Centre for Mobilities Research at Lancaster. I'm hoping that some of you will have heard of it, but if not, this is an invitation to make contact with us and join us. The centre was established in 2003 by the late John Ery and Mimi Scheller. Its current director, a new director, is Dr. Nicholas Sperling. Excuse me, and as Gao said, I'm currently the co-director for the Humanities. So yes, very warm greetings. Of course, at this time we're having rather less visitors physically than we have in the past, but we are hopeful that in the future some of you might be able to come and join us. Next slide, please. Okay, yes, I just threw this in because I wanted to advertise the fact that CeMoRe is about to begin a new 5-year programme dedicated specifically to the climate emergency. And again, if any of you out there are interested in this topic and would like to make contact with us vis-a-vis the events and hopefully publications we're going to embark upon over the next 5 years, please do so. And thank you. Next slide. And these are the contacts. So my understanding is, well, this is being recorded, so you will get to see the slides again later. But if you would like to contact us at CeMoRe, these are the key names. Nicholas Sperling as director, myself for any humanities initiatives. And in particular, if you would like to join our mailing list, if you're not already a member of the mailing list, contact our administrator, Harriet Phipps, and she will join you to the mailing list. The mailing list is amazing. We've now got over 1,500 members. So it's a fantastic way of communicating news, events, you know, even people during the pandemic have been putting up very quite personal posts on the on the site. So please join us and join in these conversations. Thank you. Okay, and then just to say a few words very quickly about the ever expanding mobilities and humanities field. It's been quite extraordinary, really, because since the colloquium that Peter Merriman and I first held at Lancaster in 2014, mobility humanities as a subfield has really taken off, as evidenced in particular by these two new centres for work on mobility humanities. One, the Academy for Mobility Humanities at the University of Konkuk in South Korea, and MUHU, the Centre for Advanced Studies in Mobility and Humanities at the University of Padova or Padua in Italy. And I should say that both these centres have got enviable amounts of money. Korea, at Konkuk, they've got 7 years funding, government funding, and at Padova, they've got 5 years funding. So I present that to you as an indication of the extent to which mobility humanities has taken off as a subfield, which is really exciting for all those of us who have been involved, obviously, in its inception, and all those of you, hopefully, that would see yourself as scholars working in this field. Okay, thank you. Oh yes, and then finally, yeah, just a little plug here for the book series, which I'm a co-director of, the Palgrave Studies in Mobilities, Literature and Culture. This came out of a conference we held in Lancaster in 2017. We had a launch event then. And I'm pleased to say that since then, 2017, 2018, we've now got 8 titles published and more on the way. And really this is to say again to all of you, if you've got any books pending and are working on mobility, please do consider us as a possible publisher. And you'll see by just quickly looking through this list that we do have migration titles. And that's also why I've included the one at the bottom, the forthcoming title, Roger Bromley's book, Narratives of Forced Mobility and Displacement in Contemporary Literature and Culture. Roger Bromley's a very esteemed colleague in the UK, very much involved in the beginnings of cultural studies, you know, way back in the 70s and 80s. And we're delighted that he's contributing this book on mobility and displacement to the series. So yeah, please do consider us. Thank you. Okay then, so moving on now to just a quick outline of the presentation I'm going to share with you today. As you can see from this, it's in 3 parts, and this was a decision to try and make you know, this kind of format work for us, perhaps in perhaps a bit more of an interactive way than just one long talk. So what I've decided to do is, first of all, just share with you a short section of a book chapter entitled Mobile Methods and Textual Practice, because I thought it would be useful before I get onto my main paper to just say a little bit about the field of mobility and humanities. And also just a few words about how literary scholars, text-based scholars altogether are probably amongst the last in the humanities to really engage with mobility scholarship. And I'll just throw out a few reasons why. And I thought that might be an interesting discussion point for all of us afterwards as well. So that's just a brief introduction to thinking about mobility humanities. Then I'll move on to the paper proper. And this is an extract from an article I've just started working on called Driving North, Driving South Reprised. And the reprised is the crucial bit of this because it picks up on a book chapter that I wrote in 1999, so actually 20 years ago. And that was my first foray into writing about automobility. And so what I'm working on now is thinking about that early work from the perspective of 20 years hence. And as you'll see, I'm very interested in how we think about change in relationship to ephemeral landscapes like the road, about driving as well. And again, although it sounds quite specific, I'm hoping that there will be plenty in there to be of interest to people working across many different topics and disciplines. And of course, I do draw on autoethnography, which I remember Gao saying would probably be of interest to people just as a methodology option. So that will be the main paper. And then again, we'll stop for questions and discussion. And then I'll come back again and just say a few words by way of conclusion to my paper, and then open things up to further discussion. Okay, so I hope that's helped everybody get a sense of what's going to happen in the next little while. Yeah, just a few references here. That's the top one is the original chapter from 1999, which I will be referring to at points in my main talk. And I guess all my work at the moment is very much coming out of my two recent book publications, Drivetime from 2016 and Mobility, Memory and the Life course from 2019. So in the last few years, I've really focused in on mobility, and it's become something of a passion for me now. It's probably the best direction I've ever taken my work in. So hopefully I can communicate some of that enthusiasm to you. Okay then, oh, I'm not sure that is the right slide for now, actually. Could you just go back again or go on again? Yeah, okay. Yeah, sorry, just go back to the outline for the moment, if that's okay. That's it. Yeah. And maybe just to the outline, the one before that. Perfect, yeah. So we can just hold it there while I start my talk. And as I say, I'm going to begin by just reading a section from the paper on mobility humanities and the methods associated with that before I get on to the main paper talking about roads. Okay then, so here I begin. Now that the mobilities turn has come of age, there's been a great deal of debate as to its origins, and in particular whether its roots belong in the humanities or the social sciences. Since Scheller and Urry's pronouncement of a new mobilities paradigm in 2006, there has unquestionably been an alignment of mobilities research with the social sciences and innovative mobile methods, many of them centered on ethnography and digital technologies. However, as Tim Creswell and Peter Merriman have pointed out in several recent publications, mobility had been identified as a key concept through which to understand the connectedness and flux of the material world several years before this. Merriman points in particular to Creswell's introduction to the New Formation special issue on mobility from 2001, which, quote, traces a genealogy of mobility theory and mobile metaphors that are more attuned to the humanities literatures than any nascent social science paradigm. This said, Urry's own flagship book in the field, Mobilities from 2007, which complements Creswell's On the Move from 2006, is careful to acknowledge the contribution of the geographers, especially Nigel Thrift's work on non-representational theory, as well as the philosophical roots of both schools in the process philosophy of Bergson, Deleuze-Guattari, and de Certeau. It's also notable that both Creswell and Urry have drawn extensively upon literary and film text in the course of their publications on mobilities-related topics, as have their followers. This itself relates to a key principle that underpins all mobilities theory and speaks to its complexity, namely the recognition that while mobility is one of the core materialities in the post-industrial world, its lived experience, which habitually mixes cognitive and sensory perception in the present with memory, fancy, and the imagination, is necessarily an elusive phenomenon to research. Indeed, in an earlier book, Sociology Beyond Societies from 1999, Eri was already stressing the importance of studying the mobilities of everyday life in ways that accounted for the corporeal, imagined, and virtual, thus hinting at the important role textual materials might contribute to our understanding of mobilities of various kinds in ontological terms. However, it's only relatively recently that those working in the mobilities field have directly confronted the methodological implications of using textual sources as a means of social and cultural analysis. Further, and notwithstanding Eri's early acknowledgement of the role of memory and the imagination in the lived experience of mobility, scholarship in the field is markedly post-humanist in character and typically concerned with the mobile subject only as part of an integrated flow of human and non-human actors. The mobilities paradigm, as conceived by Scheller and Eri, was indeed strongly influenced by Bruno Latour's actor network theory in this regard, and those following in their footsteps have insisted that we attend to the circulation of goods, finance, commodities, data, and so on, alongside the movement of people. As John Law, who was instrumental in popularising an ant approach to science and technology studies, observes, quote, "What we call the social is materially heterogeneous. Talk, bodies, text, machines, architectures, all of these and many more are implicated in and perform the social." Excuse me. As well as decentering the human subject in mobilities research, Ant's emphasis on the interdependence of humans and things has also led to the conceptualization of human, non-human entities, such as Tim Dant's The Driver Car, which epitomizes the way in which humans are stitched into the complex global systems when performing everyday tasks in which they are the ostensible agents. So really just something that I'm sure you're aware of, but just to underline the very interesting tension that exists for all of us these days working across the humanities and social sciences about whether we adopt a post-humanist approach or whether humanism, for all its problems, remains a kind of worldview that we can't do without. So again, that would be something really interesting to discuss with you in a moment. Excuse me. Meanwhile, for literary scholars whose work has historically centred on the individual subject through the study of textual characters, post-human revisionings of the world through frameworks such as these are clearly at odds with the project of a good deal of criticism, namely to gain a better understanding of the human psyche and its capacity or not to exercise choice and hence determine the life course of the self and others. Further, to shift one's attention so emphatically away from the agency of the individual subject is also to undermine the Enlightenment belief in freedom and progress, which has sustained so much political criticism. Obviously, thinking about feminist criticism here, for example, or indeed Marxist and materialist approaches. This said, the benefits of a post-human distributed cognition approach to textual materials is that it enables us to grasp the contingency of the subject within a systems-based social order with new clarity, and from a mobilities perspective, to recognise that mobile human lives cannot be separated from those of other animals, or indeed the machines, commodities and services that constitute the fabric of daily life. And again, the ethical implications of this are really wide and something we might like to talk about in a moment. The reason I've dwelt on the post-human theories which underpin a good deal of mobility scholarship in the space available to me is that they have unquestionably come to define the field in terms of approach and methodology. This means that a purely thematic interest in movement and mobility, as foregrounded in the work of a great many modernist and indeed post-colonial literary scholars over the past 50 years, does not automatically qualify as mobilities research according to the terms of the paradigm. This is not, of course, to discredit work on mobility that predates or is ignorant of the CeMoRe school, but to clarify that this research will be based on different assumptions and is likely to have different objectives, and to reach out to different audiences than that being pursued by many of my colleagues at Lancaster. Indeed, in my own work, I found myself having constantly to review the methodological implications of employing post-humanist and indeed phenomenological approaches in my preliminary investigations of text, while simultaneously drawing upon psychology and post-structuralist models of subjectivity in my further cultural and historical analysis. For example, when considering the role of individual memory in the evolution of long-term relationships. So this is certainly something that I've had to struggle with in my own work, because basically there are many different frameworks which I feel necessary to enable me to think about the things that I'm most interested in. Anyway, despite the obvious post-structuralist caveats that surround the use of literary and other text as resources for anyone wishing to gain a window onto the ontological experience of mobility, it's unquestionable that they also provide the researcher with something that cannot easily be accessed through ethnography, namely the complicating factor of temporality, both in terms of the individual life and our collective past. Colin Pooley's historical research into early 20th century transport mobilities is exemplary in this regard, inasmuch as the autobiographical texts with which he works have enabled him to piece together a sense of how individuals experienced the many new forms of transport that became available at the turn of the century, often in a surprisingly integrated way. In my own work on 20th century automobility, meanwhile, I've drawn on both autobiographical and fictional materials to explore the changes in what I've termed automotive consciousness across the century, including an investigation of how the imagination, daydream, and memory are an integral part of the mobilities performed during both driving and passengering. While such representations are hardly an unmediated snapshot onto everyday life during the period in question, they can, I believe, be annexed by the cultural theorist to help model key cultural and social phenomena, especially when placed alongside existing empirical research. And on this point, always worth mentioning Henri Lefebvre's work, Lefebvre on representational space. Obviously, this is a concept which really helps to explain not only the role that texts play in mediating and shaping our lived experience of the world, but also why the writers of a given historical period make certain cultural phenomena part of the symbolic landscape of the text. In other words, a virtuous circle is established whereby textual and other representations inform the lived experience of material subjects, whose exploits then become the fodder for further textual representations of the same. Representation, then, is a term with several distinct but overlapping connotations when it comes to mobilities research, but one that can be very positively exploited. However, just a few final words here. To return to the question of why mobility scholars working in literary studies have, in literary studies have either remained ignorant of the mobilities paradigm or have been reluctant to engage with it, I think we also need to look beyond post-humanism and recognise the breadth of our parent discipline and the fact that it's populated with innumerable paradigms and subfields of its own. In my editorial capacity on the Mobilities Literature and Culture book series, for example, I've noticed that the main framework that our authors draw upon to engage with the concept of mobility is modernism. This is very interesting because there are indeed a number of groundbreaking books on modernism, such as Stephen Kern's wonderful The Culture of Time and Space, first published in 1983. Which engage with the speed, movement, and mobility spawned by modernity in philosophically rich and complex ways, and hence return us to the issue of whether it was the humanities rather than the social science that led the way in naming mobility as the leitmotif of our age. Similarly, Post-colonial studies, especially where it intersects with work on travel and migration more broadly, predates many of the debates that have since been pursued by the sociologist, and might present itself as a more obvious frame of reference for the contributors to our series than the new mobilities paradigm. This said, I feel strongly that the best way to enrich mobility scholarship further is to grow mobility humanities into a cutting-edge subfield which attends to all the traditions and theoretical and methodological frameworks which potentially inform it. For that reason, we encourage the contributors to the Mobilities Literature and Culture book series to reflect on the ways in which their own research is in dialogue with the new mobilities paradigm, as well as attend to their own frameworks. This is already leading to the publication of many rich and fascinating books and articles that are of interest to readers from multiple disciplinary backgrounds. By connecting concepts, frameworks, and methodologies in this way, I think that mobility humanities really does have the potential to take mobility scholarship forward over the next decade. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to pause there just after that very brief engagement with the whole concept of mobility humanities to see if anybody would like to ask any questions or share any observations. I'd be really interested to hear.
Thank you, Lynn. I would like to remind all participants, all audience, that please feel free to raise your hand if you would like to ask question via audio. And you are also invited to ask question via text in the chat box if you wish. So either way, I will be able to communicate to Lynn about the questions. There's a question in the chat box from Valerie McGuire, who comments that thank you for this exciting research and clearly presented. Is this presentation a chapter within your book?
Okay, thanks for that. Actually, what I've just read to you is an extract from a book chapter, not in my book, but it's actually the first reference showing on the screen at the moment. It's a chapter in the collection From Time to Time and Place to Place, Movement and Change in Literature, Language and Society. Yes. Having said that, I do discuss these issues also in my most recent book, Mobility, Memory and the Life course, and have indeed also spoken about it in the introduction to the volume, the edited collection that Marion Aguiar and Charlotte Mattison and I produced for the Mobilities Literature Culture book series. So thinking about the whole methodological implications of bringing humanities into mobilities research is something I find very interesting. And I think what I'm especially interested in is the fact that scholars in the humanities have been pretty slow to engage with mobilities research and the paradigm. And as I've just said, I think it's to do with the fact that all of us working in literary subjects have got so many other subfields, frameworks, whatever to attend to as well. So in a sense, we had our own frames of reference without mobilities. But yes, the answer to the question is what I've shared with you today is in this chapter, Mobile Methods and Textual Practice.
And Dr. Gaohen Zhang asks, how do you view textual sources in relation to the humanities?
Interesting. I'd probably like to come back and say, ask a little bit more about that question. What you're meaning by textual sources, I could answer that in different ways. I mean, the first thing I would say is that for me personally, textual sources are very wide and varied. In my own research, I do deal with literary text, but I also deal with very wide-ranging cultural text as well. So, for example, in my roads research, which I'll be talking about in a moment, I think one of the sources I'm going to have to go to is road enthusiast websites. So for me, the first thing to say is that a text can be, you know, text are very heterogeneous. They can be all sorts of things. But if it's also a question about the status of the text or the authority of the text, I think that then relates to what I tell everybody about my own position, which is that, you know, I'm very much not a literary critic. I don't work with text in order to evaluate them. I don't work with text in order to explicate them, or, you know, the text isn't the object of my research, if you like. The text for me is something that I can use to explore a social or cultural phenomenon. And again, I think that's a very interesting and important methodological choice, and one that the scholars aren't always aware of. You ask people how they're using text, and I think very often they don't exactly know the way in which they're mobilizing them. Thank you.
We actually have a third question from Christina Varade, who thanks you for your excellent discussion. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see how mobility crosses from the modern to the postmodern, and especially what mobilities in literature can contribute to the discussion on a meaningful level, i.e. something that will speak to the social scientists, scientific humanities subfields that tend to receive more attention these days?
Gosh, that's a really good question, and of course a very big question. If I could just break it down a bit. Was that so? Could I just clarify, Ham? Was that modernism and postmodernism, or modernism and posthumanism?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll unmute myself. I just have some things in the background here.
Yeah.
So I was looking at, you're right. I meant to write modernism and posthumanism.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think it's extremely interesting, all of this. What I say to colleagues at Lancaster, who are mostly social scientists, is that I think we've got to be open to the fact that sociologists, and in particular sociologists that work with the new mobilities paradigm, we don't own mobilities, or we don't own the concept of mobility. And I think what's going to happen, or maybe certainly what is already happening with the mobilities literature culture book series, is that a space is being made for colleagues who want to pursue mobility in different ways. And I'm hoping that when those voices become strong enough, we will be able to start having some quite robust discussions about, in a sense, who has ownership of the concept, or how we might meaningfully bring a post-humanist and a more traditional notion of or the other thematics of mobility together, I should say. It's really interesting. It's a difficult one theoretically. I would say that there are similar debates going on in geography around phenomenology and post-phenomenology, and some scholars are, I think they've got themselves into quite a tight corner. I think with posthumanism and post-phenomenology, you can get yourself in a corner where it's actually impossible to go back and open up the possibility of thinking about, humanist approaches to things, but then you'll get other scholars who are probably like myself trying to tread a line and actually take take from both, because both ways of looking at the world do have advantages and limitations. But it's whether that you're somebody that can work with the knowledge that to move between the two. You, in a sense, are doing something quite unorthodox to do that. So my colleagues, many of my colleagues at Lancaster are very post-humanist, and I don't think that they would shift really in their approach. But maybe it's humanities scholars that are going to be a bit more flexible and be open to different ways of thinking. Thank you, Christina, by the way. It's nice to see a face as well, so please do come in. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the questions. Would you like to move on to the second part of your presentation?
Yes, I will do. Thank you very much, Han. Thank you. Okay, so now for something a little bit different. So now I'm going to talk to you from about my new research on roads, which is obviously coming out of my earlier research on driving. And as I explained at the beginning, I'm going to be reading in particular from a new paper I'm working on, which is called Driving North, Driving South, Reprised. Okay, yeah, I'm hoping that this piece of writing will serve as a pilot for my next book on Britain's changing roadscapes from the 1960s to the present. So that's what I'm building up to. This is like a pilot article for hopefully another big project. Okay, I think we can move on to the next slide now, which should show a map of the UK. And just before I start, something else occurred to me last night when I was reading through my notes, and that is some of my terminology might be a bit alien to a Canadian audience. Though again, maybe or maybe not, but I think that our motorways in the UK are the equivalent of your expressways. Is that right? That's what you would think of as that type of road. And A roads in the UK are a type of arterial road, but my guess is more variable in size and standard than your arterial roads. Some of our A roads can be pretty small roads as well. So just bear that in mind when I'm talking about the different types of roads. Okay. So as you'll see, this research draws in part on my personal experience of driving the length and breadth of the UK over the past 30 years, and in that respect is about a migration of sorts. The journey I made from my natal home in Cornwall at the southernmost tip of the UK to the north of England, where I went to university, are typical of many of my generation, and even more so for those who have followed. 40 years on, there are still no universities or indeed motorways in Cornwall, meaning that all the young people who want to go into a profession have to leave and relatively few return. The first part of the paper I'd like to share is the introduction, followed by a section of analysis focused on my autoethnography, after which I'll stop for a break and any questions or observations. And as I say, then the third part of the paper will be my preliminary conclusions. So yeah, just setting up this research really and putting it into a bit of context. In 2004, the journal Theory, Culture and Society hosted a double special issue on automobilities that has since become a touchstone for all subsequent research on driving, the car system, car cultures and roads. My own early work on the phenomenology of driving coincided with this signal moment in mobility scholarship, and the paper I present here is in effect a reprise of the autoethnography which sat at the heart of my chapter, Driving North, Driving South, 20 years on. While this millennial account of my journeys between Cornwall and Scotland was written as a contribution to the post-1997 debates about changing identity politics in the UK, and that was as the result of the devolution of our nation, my more recent research is focused on the ontology of driving, and in particular, the way in which the embodied sensations unique to automobility combine with cognitive processes such as remembering, daydreaming, and problem solving. This approach chimes with the work of automotive psychologists who, since the days of J.J. Gibson in the 1930s, have been fascinated by the way in which driving, as what John Groger calls a complex everyday task, combines habitual and reactive cognitive skills in a unique way. This facility enables drivers to think about things in addition to driving during their journeys. My work on representations of driving in literary text has nevertheless revealed that the practice and sensation of driving, as well as the driver's engagement with the world as seen from the windscreen, both constrains and directs automotive thinking in ways that are often productive and enlightening. Encounters with familiar roadside features, both specific and generic, can prompt all manner of memories, while the forward motion of the vehicle may induce euphoric, future-orientated daydreaming or helps resolve personal dilemmas, as I talk about in my analysis of Joan Didion's novel, Played as It Lays, in my book Drivetime. It's a very fascinating novel to think about how driving can actually help us when we're suffering from quite severe psychological distress. While my previous research focused on the content of such thinking and led me in a separate project to consider the role mobilities play in the formation and sustenance of intimate relationships, my attention has now returned to the road itself and the question of how our spatial, sensory, and perceptual apprehension of an ephemeral landscape is an integral part of everyday life. What memories are activated? What expectations disturbed? In other words, how do changes to familiar roadscapes interact with or map onto the life histories of those who travel along them, and to what effect? While from a phenomenological viewpoint, these are fascinating questions in and of themselves, they may also be seen to contribute indirectly to topical debates in mobility scholarship regarding the widespread social change needed to facilitate rapid decarbonisation. By understanding more about the psychological and affective complexity of the travel experience vis-à-vis changes to infrastructure and environment, including the deep attachments travellers develop for extended space, planners will be better placed to ease the transition to e-mobility, autonomous mobility, shared space, or co-mobility. As the work of contemporary archaeologists like Seffryn Penrose and Catherine Morrison has shown, one of the best ways of gauging society's preparedness for emerging futures is to better understand their relationship to the recent past. What such inquiries tell us is that changes to the built environment are typically met with resistance in the first instance on account of the way that familiarity with almost any domain quickly lodges itself in the psyche as an attachment. However, by the same token, change is subsequently accommodated far more quickly than one might expect once those using the space in question form new associations with it as part of their regular habits and routines. And again, there's probably several of you there who are familiar with recent research on habit and routine. Colleagues of mine, David Bissell, the geographer, well, both geographers, David Bissell and Tim Edensaw, have written very interestingly and importantly on the whole significance of habit and routine to our relationship with space and place. Excuse me. In order to explore this further level of driver experience, I've adopted a methodology which combines autoethnography with textual analysis. So this is picking up on Gav's point earlier about how do I understand text, or what is the role of text. I draw upon wide-ranging sources, including autobiography, fiction, journalism, and road enthusiast websites. Notwithstanding the critical awareness required for working with materials whose representational status means that they can never be presented as straightforward empirical evidence, such texts provide invaluable insights into the more complex psychological aspects of automotive consciousness, in contrast to the ethnographic research, which has focused on, for example, commuting or long-distance lorry driving. So it really does sit at a tangent to probably what most research on driving has looked at in terms of personal experience. In addition, it's arguable that only textual sources, quite a big claim, but I would like to make it that it's only textual sources of a more reflective kind that are able to contextualize driving events historically through their unique blend of the personal historical and the social historical. Roads are, of course, one of the most evocative markers of this living environment in this regard, with their topographical constants such as surface, slope, and camber in constant tension with the ephemerality of their street furniture. Surfaces, signage, crash barriers, telephone boxes, vegetation, etc., record a constant process of decay and renewal, while every so often a new wayside housing estate, wind turbine, or e-charging station will appear and change the character of the road forever. The enormity of the latter in the lives of road users is poignantly captured in Chris Cooper's compelling photographic history of the Great North Road in England. So the Great North Road is one that runs from, if I can show you on the map, runs from London through up to Edinburgh. As Cooper observes, and this is a great quote, he says, "The next time an old factory is knocked down and the site built on, wait a few months, then go back and see if you can remember exactly where it stood." The implication being, of course, that you can't remember it. Once a landscape feature disappears, it's incredibly hard to re-presence it by going back to look at it. In this paper, it's precisely this order of road user experience that I'm interested in, namely how the subtle and not so subtle changes excuse me, in the British roadscape, including the growth in traffic and vehicle use, interact with the living memories of those who use them to create a novel biography of the routes in question. Working with extracts from several autobiographical accounts of my journeys between Cornwall and Lancashire and Scotland during the period 2015 to 2020, themselves set alongside my original document from 1999, I reflect upon both how the roads and the driving experience has changed since the millennium. Here, it's also important to note that I began researching and writing this article at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, a time which automobility scholars hailed as an unprecedented opportunity to envisage the world after the car, and I think perhaps over-optimistically to see it as a moment in which we might fast track our exit from what John Ery famously referred to as the car system. However, although one of my sections of autoethnography was written during the first period of national lockdown, I've purposefully resisted making it the exclusive focus or vantage point for this piece of writing, because my objective is to document the wider archaeological changes that have been mounting steadily over the past 20 years. And I think this is going to be quite important for me to actually configure my research as one which is looking at this longer period of time, rather than focusing on the now, or indeed taking the standpoint of the now. I actually want to kind of like immerse myself in that 20-year historical period. Yeah. In order to best capture the qualitative similarities and differences of my journeys north and south between the millennium and today, I've adopted a snapshot method which compares and contrasts my accounts of a selection of locations and zones which feature repeatedly in the autoethnographies. So I turn now to an example of this textual practice, which compares the journey I made to Cornwall in September 2019, so just over a year ago, with the one featured in my Driving North, Driving South chapter from 1999. So, you know, really looking at the contrast, the changes that have happened over that 20-year period. So next slide, please. Okay, so one of the features of my original chapter in that piece is that the piece concludes with a speculation on what it would be like to make the same journey 30 years hence. So writing in 1999, I'm actually looking ahead 30 years, I guess, to what would be 2030. So this is what I write in 1999. I write, in 30 years maximum, car travel between homes, partners, and the various towns, cities, and regions of these islands will be as economically and logistically impossible as it was 40 years hitherto. The way we know home now will not be the same as we knew it then. Time and space will be differently experienced, differently calibrated. My vision of Cornwall from the A30, with the music blaring, carelessly blending the 1970s into the 1990s, will simply not be available anymore. So my attempt at a bit of prophecy. On first inspection, it would seem that my somewhat apocalyptic prediction, based, I guess, on the assumption that escalating congestion and environmental crisis would bring automobility to a standstill within a few decades, was somewhat overstated. 20 years later, here I am, still driving the same route. However, the textual extracts that follow may, upon reflection, be seen to show that what I predicted is nevertheless in the process of unfolding. The nation's traffic may still be moving for now, but sometimes only just. The objective of the discussion which follows is thus to capture the subtle and elusive ways in which change manifests itself through the experience of the road user. What do we see? What do we miss? And most importantly, what do the vanishing and reconstituting features of a familiar landscape make us think and feel? I've elected to structure my discussion according to particular locations or temporal spatial zones along my route, which begins in Lancaster, follows the M6, M5 and A30 south to Cornwall, before returning to Lancaster via the same roads, and then sets off again 2 days later from my home in Scotland via the M6, A74, M8, A82 and A85. Could we just go back to the slide with the map for just 1 second? Thanks, yeah. Again, it's hard for me to point this out to you, but all you need to know really is that Cornwall, my home in Cornwall, is at the far southernmost tip of the United Kingdom or the British Isles, and where I live now is halfway up the west coast of Scotland at the far north. So it's a lot of travelling. The journey time between Cornwall and Lancaster is about 400 miles, and then another 250 miles, 300 miles from Lancaster up to Scotland. I know those distances aren't going to mean a lot to you in Canada. I mean, that's probably just like a local drive for a lot of you, but in the UK, that's quite a big drive. And as you'll find out from what I'm going to say, a drive that takes increasingly long amounts of time because of the amount of traffic which we now have on British roads. Okay, so to continue, methodologically, this broadly geographical organisation presented itself as the obvious, though by no means the only choice, especially once I began to review the pieces of autoethnography. Perhaps not surprisingly, my retrospective accounts of individual journeys, typically written a day or two after the event, have tended to carve them up into familiar temporal spatial units. For example, setting off and the early part of the journey. So that's kind of like one unit that I typically talk about. Service stations and other stops is something else I repeatedly feature on. architectural and other features, driving pleasures and or obstacles such as lots of traffic, and then finally the end of the journey and arrival home. So these are the things that I find myself repeatedly describing when I write these reflective autobiographical pieces. What's clearly visible in the extracts I go on to discuss here, however, is that the significance of these zones exceeds both their geographical and temporal markers. Each zone has acquired meaning for myself as driver over time and is entangled with thought processes and effects by dint of the fact that the practice is repeated. Looking back over my documents, it's clear that my journeys both north and south have been structured, indeed constrained, by the schema of the thoughts and feelings that have become associated with specific locations and phases of the journey. What the texts reveal is not only what I see and look out for time and time again, but also what I'm likely to, also the fact that I'm likely to experience a reproducible gamut of emotions when I encounter them. Therefore, although a good deal of my observation is focused often anxiously on looking out for signs of change on the roads I travel, it's certain that there will be a good deal more that I miss, precisely because it's not been brought to my habitual field of perception or indeed my structures of feeling. And I'll come back to this in a moment. What we see and what we don't see is really endlessly fascinating when you're looking at a transient landscape like a road. So I'm moving on now to a demonstration of this methodology with reference to my changing experience of driving the A30 in Cornwall over this 20-year period. Excuse me. So the A30, so this is one of Britain's long arterial roads. The A30 has long competed with the A38 for the title of the longest lane in England, a description which neatly combines the romance and nostalgia now associated with Britain's old A roads and their reputation for traffic jams and frustrated driving. During my lifetime, however, the Cornish stretch of the A30 has been subject to several major upgrades and is now dual carriageway for most of its length. And by dual carriageway, I mean 4 lanes, so like two lanes either side of a central barrier. Indeed, it's the nearest thing the county has to a motorway. Excuse me. With reference back to my 1999 text, written not long after the last dueling was completed, it can be seen that it's a driving space which has always figured very differently for me depending upon whether my direction of travel was south or north. And I'll just share a couple of pieces of ethnography with you here. So could we just go back one more slide, please? Seem to have lost some of my text. Okay. Right, I don't know, it's gone off the screen, so sorry about that. I'm just going to have to read it to you. Okay, it's not very long. Apart from some stretches of dual carriageway and the wind farm at Four Boroughs, this road, for one thing, never seems to change. It will always be here to take me home. It will always be here to provide me with my dream of home, the last breath, the suspended moment before arrival. Cornwall, as seen from the A30, no longer a country in which I live perhaps, but one to which I'm obliged to return again and again. So the key things to focus on there is dual carriageway and wind farm. Okay, on to the next slide. Thank you. So A30 northbound. And again, this is from the original 1999 text. The persona that sped down these roads with such hope of integration is now the loosest collection of signifiers, and the landscape framed by my car window this time means little to me. Even when I cross the border back into England, and here you need to know that Cornwall thinks of itself as a separate country, although it doesn't have that status, but it likes to think of itself in that way. Even when I cross the border back into England with its Kerno Isni England graffiti recently whitewashed out, I am unstirred. Although shortly afterwards, I begin to think of coffee and the fact that it will soon be time to wake up. Okay, so What these extracts capture and what the phrase hope of integration alludes to is the way in which this journey home had over time assumed the quality of a hopeless quest to unite my adult and childhood selves, especially in the eyes of my parents. Because of this, the final 30-mile stretch from Bodmin to Redruth was always overdetermined with misplaced hopes and expectations, which at the end of the 7-hour, 380-mile long journey were frequently cloaked in euphoria. What's striking about the description here is that my psychological need to bring all parts of my life together at the journey's end completely overwrites and disregards the changes that have been taking place on the roadscape in my absence. The new dual carriageway and the wind farm were both significant material changes to the road, the latter generating a great deal of local controversy. But in my account, they figure as incidental because what I value about the road is the symbolic continuity it represents in my life. On the return journey, by contrast, both the road and myself figure as, quote, a loose collection of fragmented signifiers for whom all dreams of integration have been temporarily abandoned. Elsewhere, I've written extensively about driving as a practice that enables us to daydream productively or not in this way. But it's only now when I turn my attention to my engagements with familiar roads that I begin to see the full extent of how what we discover in the world beyond the windshield will depend upon what we bring to it. Which is not to say that change can always be accommodated as easily as my casual disregard of the new dual carriageway and the wind farm in my entry here. My account of driving the same stretch of road in 2019, 20 years on, is a perfect case in point. While no longer making the journey back to Cornwall with the same dreams of home and belonging, it was nevertheless undertaken for the purpose of reconnecting meaningfully with the past, as I guess all such journeys are. On this occasion, however, the sheer volume of traffic on the A30 on my southbound journey obliterates my view of the road, both literally and symbolically. Another slide, please. Okay, so, and this is 2019. Oakhampton is only 65 miles from Truro, and in good condition, I should have got to my rental accommodation in little more than an hour. However, it would be another 3 hours and 7:30 at night before I made it there on account of the miles and miles of congestion on the A30 as I neared Truro. I forget exactly at which junction I began to experience problems, but the long snake of traffic shunting its way south on Friday evening in late September was a jaw-dropping experience for me. True, I'd had a similar experience when I travelled down 4 years ago. That was in 2015. But there were roadworks on that occasion, and I'd assumed it was a one-off. Clearly not. Talking to friends when I finally arrived, I was told that the commuter traffic in and out of Truro is like this every night, a potent symbol of one of the county's most concerning demographic trends. Meanwhile, my return journey in 2019 is qualitatively different to the one I recorded even 4 years previously, in 2015. And before I talk about my return in 2019, I just want to share what I wrote in 2015. So next slide, please. In my 2015 text, I recapture some of the old euphoria and love of the road that characterized my driving 20 years ago. This is what I write. It's a beautiful spring morning in Cornwall, and with the sun behind me throwing glancing rays across the land, I am flying once more. The light show over Bodmin Moor is particularly spectacular, with the big hills, Brown Willie and Routor picked out sharply. In 2019, by contrast, my entry begins with further reflections on the extent of the commuter traffic clogging up the road on weekday mornings, and the fact that even when the congestion eases, the quality of the driving is no longer the same. Next slide, please. So here we are, 2019. From Indian Queens onwards, I start to make good time and maintain a steady cruising speed of 70 to 80 miles an hour, most of the way to Exeter, where I join the motorway. It has not exactly been an open road, however, even early on a Tuesday morning. Even at this time, there's a good deal of traffic of every kind, cars, freight, and LGVs. I have to work quite hard to maintain my speed through constant overtaking where this is possible. Both southbound and northbound, the A30, one of Britain's most historic and romantic roads, is no longer easily seen or enjoyed. And I'm reminded that there are approximately 10 million more vehicles on the road than there were when I used to make the journey in the late 1990s. And also that about 4 million tourists now visit Cornwall every year, mostly via this route. Okay, so that was just a glimpse of one sort of fragment of autoethnography and the sorts of reflections it inspired. Now moving on to another section, which is focused on a visit to a service station. So this is my visit to Taunton Deane service station. So this is about 150 miles north of my home in Cornwall. So I continue. One of the benefits of writing a detailed account of a long journey such as this is that it registers the extent to which a driver's mood and indeed their relationship to the road can change during the course of their travels, sometimes unexpectedly. On this occasion, my stop at Taunton Deane Services proved to be a reassuring, restorative experience on account of the fact that at 10 a.m, it was very quiet and superficially at least bore few signs of change. Indeed, it was notably more restful than my visit there on the exceptionally hot day described in my 1999 autoethnography. So here, again, just a short snippet of autoethnography. I arrive at Taunton Deane Services before 10 a.m. and am surprised by how empty it is, especially compared to the motorway itself. This is a relief and reassuring, especially when I take my dog for a walk and see that nothing much has changed in the general feel or layout of the site. I climb the grassy slope to the wooded area that fringes the perimeter fence, as I did nearly 30 years ago with my first dog, Mitty, just 4.5 years ago with my second dog, Star. Now Sona, 1.5, is sniffing around in the bushes, unaware of the welcome sense of continuity she unwittingly gives me. As we wander back along the crest of the hill, I survey the car park more closely and notice for the first time that 2 electric charging stations have been installed. I stop and take a photo. Next slide, please. I stop and take a photo and recall that in 1999, it was Taunton Deane that prompted my speculations on where the British road system would be 30 years hence. So that extract that I shared with you a little bit back, that was where I had thought about, where would transport be in 30 years' time. And I think that's because it's the point in the return journey where our dependence on the motorway network really hits home. So anyway, here's the picture I took on that day, just over a year ago at Taunton Deane Services. As my entry goes on to record, this topographically familiar place nevertheless proves to be more changed than I originally thought. Next slide, please. And yeah, continuing. Still reflecting on all this as I head to the service area for a coffee, I begin to look round more intently for signs of change. Once inside the main building, I see that it's been subject to a major refit and that multiple new outlets have replaced the large cafeteria that still dominated the complex even 4.5 years ago. Costa Coffee has also taken over the separate building opposite the main entrance, though I now struggle to remember what it was in its previous incarnations. I think it was probably something like a Burger King when I was last here, though way back in time, I think it might even have been a tourist information kiosk. It's only when I make my way back to the car, however, that I'm reminded that something else is missing. A vehicle is now parked at one of the EV charging stations, the driver standing next to his vehicle, drinking a coffee and talking on the phone. Alongside my interest in seeing at least one EV being charged, I'm suddenly reminded that there are no longer any phone booths outside the service station entrance. My memory is that there was a significant cluster of red boxes here for many years, and also that I used one of them to call a friend on my way home in 1999. And I have got a second slide there. If you just move on to the next picture. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so it's my car with the door open and the EV charging in the background. You can't see the guy very well, but he is stood there behind his vehicle drinking some coffee. So what these entries reveal, or sorry, what these entries record then is not only the sort of material changes that would have been visited on most British service stations in the past 20 years, but also changes in visitor habits. On this occasion, the familiarity of the dog walking area and general layout of the car park belied the changes affected by digital technology over the past 2 decades. For example, the shift to mobile phones has had the effect of inclining us to return to our cars to drink our coffee and have a chat or do business, rather than spend time in the restaurants themselves. The EV charging stations, meanwhile, are a tangible sign of the other change that is now upon us, the world's supposed commitment to rapid decarbonisation, though the fact that there are only 2 chargers in a car park designed for many hundreds of cars suggests that we've probably still got a way to go. Okay then, so again, I'm going to stop there. I've got some conclusions which I'll share with you, but I think this might be a moment to stop and just see if anybody would like to pick up on any of the things I've been talking about. I'm really interested to hear from you about your own experiences of change in familiar landscapes, and of course how any of this bears on your own research or in particular research on migration. So yeah, you know, please share with me any of your own work as well. I'd be really interested to hear.
Please go ahead, Christina.
Thank you.
Hi, Christina.
Hi. I was just thinking a lot about, you know, your discussion starting out with the changes and everything. Like during COVID, you know, initially we started out by, yes, there was this trend towards more rapid travel, globalization, you know, a lot of more airplane travel. But then in COVID now, especially like I'm based in Ireland right now. Yeah. So people are rediscovering the country. They are definitely all the staycations, driving the landscape, definitely having these experiences of revisiting the places that were in their memory to see what was there and what has changed. Yeah. I think in a way it has also this sort of positive. I don't think we need to necessarily always be focusing on the negative aspects of this, but just being aware of the changes. And also in my own experience, thinking about going from, you know, across the border from the Republic to Northern Ireland. Now there's no more, my point was always where there were the guard stations, which are no longer there. So, you know, it's clearly a very visible change from the 90s the early 90s when I was there. But, you know, these are in my own memory, things that I start to contemplate. I don't know if you can address that sort of how we perceive things.
Yeah, really interesting what you say there. I think you're making 2 points really, aren't you? You're saying one, that in a sense the COVID situation has made us experience the places where we are in a more meaningful way, which is great. But I was also fascinated with what you said, that it's also given us the opportunity to revisit places and to explore our memories, which is again is you know precisely the sort of thing that I'm interested in. I just find this so interesting. And also what you're saying, yeah, by no means are any of these things exclusively negative. Even the kind of the loss and disorientation, which I see as a consequence of change in ephemeral landscapes. I mean, these things can be disconcerting and disorientating for people. But the further point I'm going to go on to make is that that too is a moment in time, and as things change, of course, we accommodate to and with change. And I think this is clearly where all the really important recent work on repetition, routine, habit is crucial, because it's through repeated processes that we come to make space comfortable for us and to occupy it in new ways. And I guess it's just a constantly evolving process of how we negotiate the things which disappear, but then have to refamiliarize ourselves with a new terrain or a new set of coordinates, really, to fix ourselves by.
And it's also really interesting to think like intergenerationally how people might experience. I don't know if you've done any work on that as well, or interpersonal, but or if you're primarily just focusing on individual experience, but.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, was interesting. My book, Mobility, Memory, and the Life Course, was also very much about the life course, and it was thinking about mobility and intimate human relationships at different stages in people's lives. And yeah, I used autobiographical text to look at these things. I looked at a great set of diaries by a British woman called Nella Last, who recorded, she started writing diaries for the mass observation during World War II and continued them through the 1950s. So again, we've got a nice long period of time that we can look at. And it was actually very moving reading her history of how she and her husband related to excuse me, both familiar places and changing places over time. And, you know, it's, yeah, I think returning to places is it can be a very emotional thing. And, you know, as we get older, you know, it's a typical kind of quest or journey that people go on to reconnect with places they were in the past. So, you know, these things do mean differently to us, I think, at different stages in our own lives, for sure.
I also see a question in the chat box from Valerie McGuire, who mentions your method of using your journal entries to track these changes in habits really reminded me of photography. Then eventually you put photographs into your discussion. So why do you choose the written word for your text as opposed to the photograph? And she's also thinking about the earlier post-human debate you were introducing to her, that the written text is returning to the human, and is that part of your interest?
Well, yes. Well, all those things. That is such an interesting observation. And yeah, of course, whenever we throw an image into our writing, it is reminding us that, again, we've got another order of text, and, you know, it raises questions about, you know, which is the most useful text, which is the most authentic text. And I think often, you know, literary people might just throw an image in, sometimes just, you know, just to make something like look more interesting. But of course, it's, you know, it's got its own authority, it's got its own suggestiveness. I think there's lots of ways I could answer this, actually. The first thing is that my method, I think my textual method I described as a snapshot method. And I was actually, well, I was very minded when I was doing it that it's quite similar to some of the historical local history books, which I really enjoy looking at. I don't know if you have the same in Canada, I'm sure you probably do, where somebody's put together images of a place now and a place as it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So the kind of like now and then text. And what's interesting about some of those books is that they do it with both word and image. So, you know, that there is the photograph from today, there is the photograph from 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but there's nearly always some kind of textual commentary as well. So I think I need to think about that for my own method. I should say, as a bit of parallel research, I did something quite, well, similar but different a couple of years ago, and that was that I used dash cam recordings when I was driving to capture the roadscape. And then I came home and I wrote up my experience of the drive from using the dash cam. Now, of course, that is qualitatively different. I mean, it captures so much more detail from the road, but what it doesn't do, and I think this is also an answer to the question in a roundabout way, it's a reconstituted experience of the drive, And the thing it's not doing is exploring how the memory works in that process. And then I come back to that again. Why the written text is important to me is the very fact that it's often only in written text that people actually talk about memory. I mean, I suppose if you were doing a photographic project, you could be doing it in such a way to kind of like access memory, but usually the place where people are most reflective and move between the present and the past and indeed the future is in a written text. And as I was saying in that early section, I think for many social scientists, I think that must be the limit, one of the limitations of autoethnography, because if you interview somebody, the interview tends to be very much in the present. You know, you can invite them to talk about the past, but it's the kind of format where people find it quite difficult to kind of access memory. So I think for that reason, written text is always going to be really, really helpful and rich for that kind of research.
And Gaohan also mentions in the text, in the chat box, maybe a bit provocative point: in the age of big data and digital mapping, what a snapshot method would bring to the table in terms of mobilities, memories, and emotions.
Yes. Well, indeed, a very nice observation, and it seems that the second part of the question or observation is kind of answering it, isn't it? It's that, you know, I think these more modest technologies still have their place, really, and it depends what you're looking for. Of course, we can map all sorts of things now in all sorts of exciting ways. We can chart movement, but you know, how we get to understand movement and mobility as something that happens not only in the present in which we're living it, but all the past and historical associations that we bring to that present. I think that's the thing that I'm especially interested in, and maybe that's what these other sources can do for us. So yeah, maybe I should just explain that a bit more, because it's something else that I'm really interested in, namely the way in which, when we're wandering around in the world, we go out for a walk. And of course, as you probably know, there's been tons of research articles, wonderful stuff now done about walking. You know, walking is a mobile method. People describe their walks, they represent their walks in many different ways. But rarely do you get people talking about embodied experience as experience which transcends the moment in which we're living it. And this goes along with my work on driving. We may be affected by the world around us, which we're experiencing at any given time, but memories intrude all the time. And you know, the past, present, and future are always you know, the human subject is always sliding between these different temporalities, even when we are supposedly situated in the present. So yeah, in a roundabout way, again, I feel that that's why textual sources are going to remain really important to us.
Thank you so much. I don't see new questions. Would you like to proceed to the conclusion?
Sure, yeah. Okay, will do. So just a few conclusions, and this is to kind of like flag up again that this is obviously preliminary research. It's, you know, it's very much a first draft of a paper. So there's a lot more that I'm sure I'm going to pull out, but these are some of the most obvious things which have first occurred to me. So I should say that for the conclusion, I'm minded to give it the subheading, "I couldn't see the road for the cars," because this seems to sum up to me why this experience of driving the roads in 2019 was so different to the ones I used to experience in the late 1990s. So, conclusion. On my journey south to Cornwall in 2019, the weather conditions were atrocious. Excuse me. An aspect of the driving event not captured in the previous discussion. By the time I reached the A30, the situation had ameliorated somewhat, but the motorway driving between Wolverhampton and Bristol was amongst the most dangerous I've ever experienced on account of numerous cloudbursts and flash flooding. At one point, I hit a deep pool of water while travelling at 70 miles per hour in the outside lane, and my car was engulfed in a tsunami of water. Hemmed in by cars on all sides, I could see and do nothing but hold tight and drive into it. Braking would almost certainly have resulted in a pile-up. In retrospect, it's impossible to resist seeing this moment of fleeting blindness as emblematic of what my research has taught me about the challenges of capturing change. Without question, my autoethnographies have revealed as much about what a road user doesn't see as what they do, even one like me deliberately looking out for such things. Reviewing the extracts shared here, my moments of blindness include both my disregard for the new dual carriageway and wind farm on the A30 in 1999, and my delay in registering how much the services at Taunton Deane had changed on my journey north in 2019. What these failures of cognition alert us to, I think, is the incredibly wide spectrum of psychological and affective factors that mediate our relationship to the extended space of the road. As I've explored elsewhere, mood is a key determinant in the driver's relationship to the world beyond the windshield, with powerful emotions, both positive and negative, inclining the traveller to either focus in on or blot out familiar features. In cruising mode especially, drivers and passengers may be daydreaming or analysing problems that have nothing to do with the landscapes through which they pass. And on these occasions, the road functions as a temporal rather than as a spatial corridor. And so, yeah, just by way of aside, that's kind of what I was saying earlier, the fact that we can be in the moment, but also we can be very much elsewhere. In addition, several of my extracts point to the way in which the topographical familiarity of a road and its related infrastructures, for example, lay-bys and service stations, can sit in tension with its more ephemeral features. The corollary of this is that even subtle changes to our embodied experience of road space, camber, friction, or the rhythms of driving can be profoundly disorientating and distracting, leading to further blindness. Driving the once familiar Cornish country lanes in 2019, for example, I had to adjust to the increased size of the vehicles, especially family cars, which now seem to have become huge. Don't know if that's the case in Canada, I'm sure it probably is. Cars are much, much bigger in the UK than they used to be. The increased size of the vehicles squeezing past me, and as noted above, the open road sensation of motorway and dual carriageway driving has been profoundly altered as a result of the constant lane changing and adjustments to speed required by the increased volume of traffic. Taken together, these changes to the spatial environment may be seen to have impacted significantly on my 2019 journey home and frustrated my visual attentiveness to the landscape. Yet this doesn't mean that the phenomena which escaped presenting themselves to my consciousness on this occasion somehow didn't matter. My concern for the missing phone boxes at Taunton Deane services demonstrates the signal role such landmarks play in the lives of road users once they make themselves known to us, orientating us both spatially and temporally in the landscape. Indeed, they may prompt us to reflect upon how much of our own lives have changed since we were last there, serving as waymarkers for our personal histories, as well as indexes of change in the built environment. Further, on another journey, a different set of signifiers and or their absence will present themselves to us in an ongoing roller coaster of location and dislocation. In this last regard, the difference of driving a once familiar road and a still familiar road is also of significance, as illustrated by the contrast between my occasional motorway journeys south and my habitual ones between Glasgow and Tainault in Scotland. Quite apart from the fact that A roads, especially unimproved ones, would afford drivers and passengers a more intimate relationship with the roadscapes through which they pass, the routes we travel every day or several times a year bristle with small ephemeral changes that never fail to impress themselves upon us. When I return to my village in Scotland after a couple of weeks away, for example, I'm alert to the smallest additions and subtractions to the landscape. Where the tarmac has been patched, how a house build is progressing, whether the flowers on a roadside memorial have been changed, whether a neighbour's car is still parked in the carway, whether there is still a water leak in the road at the same place. These are variables that present themselves to consciousness at the level of banal curiosity and relate to my life as part of a community rather than figuring as more symbolic landmarks. At the same time, their detail reminds us of the sheer enormity of the road features that attend our journeys should our attention be drawn to them. For mobilities and transport scholars, meanwhile, these subtleties in how drivers and other road users engage with change may well be of less interest than what my reprise of a journey first made in 1999 tells us about the impact of 10 million more vehicles on Britain's roads. As noted in my earlier discussion, the total paralysis of our road system might not yet have come to pass quite yet, but the prospect of it is seemingly now well on its way. The fact that my journey south in 2019 took 15 hours as opposed to 7 in 1999 suggests that we have already passed one tipping point. In adverse traffic conditions such as those I encountered in both 2015 and 2019, the car is no longer the fastest way of travelling this route, although regrettably, the overloaded train system is not an attractive prospect either. Until recently, air travel combined with car hire presented itself as an affordable alternative, but the local routes to and from Exeter ceased in 2019, and the future of the UK's regional airports post-pandemic is very doubtful. For this reason, millions of road users, residents, tourists, business travellers, as well as freight, will continue to ply my route, M6, M5, A30, to Britain's far southwest corner for the immediate future, even if its non-sustainability on every front, including mobility itself, is literally staring them in the face. It's beyond the remit of this paper or my expertise to suggest solutions to this. However, the degradation of the travel experience however, I would assume that when pushed beyond a certain limit in terms of journey length and the degradation of the travel experience, people will simply cease to make non-essential journeys down to Cornwall. I suddenly returned from my 2019 trip, not wishing to repeat the experience in a hurry. As will be evident from my autoethnography, this is less to do with the time factor than the qualitative changes to the driving experience itself. Hemmed in by other traffic for the entirety of the journey, this is no longer my road, and for long spells, it felt that I could see nothing save for the other vehicles on the road. And here it's also worth noting that, I guess another methodological point, that by attending to the changes to the British road network over the past 20 years, exclusively from the perspective of the road user, my work sits at a tangent from most other road research that's been produced during this period. As many commentators have observed, roads mean different things to different people, whether we are living next to them, whether we've been involved in their construction, or indeed spend our lives travelling upon them. And by focusing exclusively on the latter, my own research arguably constitutes a very partial biography of the roads themselves. However, as also observed, surprisingly little road research is focused on the complex often affectionate relationship drivers and passengers develop with particular roads and roadscapes. The work of Peter Merriman and Tim Edensaw is a notable exception to this, and my own project builds in particular on the latter's 2003 autoethnographic account of driving the M6. For Merriman, Edensaw, and myself, there is a recognition that driving spaces can be as personal and significant as the spaces of our home or workplace, a locational zone in which we orientate and reorientate ourselves on a daily basis. However, once road research is scaled up to investigate the national and international significance of our highways and byways, for example, the anthropological studies of Harvey and Knox or Dalacoglu, there is a tendency for the complexity that comes specifically from use and familiarity to be forgotten. So just a point there that there have been some really significant studies of roads produced over that 20-year period, but very few of them actually look at user experience, driver experience, or indeed even the experience of people that live on or near roads. There's been much less research on that. So, as mooted in the introduction, I believe a case can be made for the value of a better understanding of road users' often surprising attachments to familiar routes and road environments when preparing for a non-carbon future. As numerous mobilities theorists have observed, no travel is purely functional. And in order to ease the general public towards electrification, co-mobility, and/or reduced mobility, we need to better understand the significance of these mobile spaces in people's lives. This relates to a further subtext in this paper, namely the importance of identifying more clearly between the different uses to which a road or a route is put. In particular, we need to distinguish between routine activities such as commuting and doing the shopping, and occasional or indeed one-off journeys such as those required by hospital appointments or attendance at a wedding or funeral. On this point, it's worth noting that roads figure symbolically in some of our most memorable life events, and the journeys concerned become part of their memorialization process. The geographer's concept of the Lifeline Route takes on new resonance in this regard, as was vividly demonstrated by my own journey south for a funeral during the coronavirus lockdown. That day, I shared the road mostly with the truckers and other utility workers engaged in the delivery of essential services, and my route, stripped bare of both commuters and tourists, felt very different. It was as though, for the first time, I could glimpse the vital role our roads, however problematic, continue to play in sustaining life as well as connecting it. If additional awareness of the variety of individual driving events could be fed into future planning, along with proper recognition of the complex and often deeply personal relationships road users develop for their roads, then we could be on our way to a useful re-evaluation of their social and cultural, as well as their economic and strategic significance. Managing change of any kind clearly depends upon a thorough understanding of why we so often resist it, and roads harbour more attachments than many of us would suspect. Okay, good to finish there. Thank you.